All right, articulation. One thing I did here is I picked up a new stick, the orange one, the HB, the middle one. And this one goes pretty much as dark as the B, but this will hold its point a little bit longer, and it will also be slightly harder to erase, which we want for the next stage, which is toning in all the darks, actually very dark. So we want some assistance in helping us retain the information we've struggled to find out here. We don't really need to be extremely dark, but we don't also need to be afraid of it, because here we're working with the area that is going to be very dark surrounding the skull. But again, we want to sort of get rid of ambiguity in the articulation stage, where we want to have a line that we can look at and say if it's correct or not. Maybe in this case I pushed it a little bit too much to the right over there, so let's just start turning it left a little bit higher up. For example, over here. But yeah, it's better to just do it and fix it rather than, you know, stay in the sort of limbo area of not knowing what to do and then not knowing what to fix. And yeah, just better to do it, and then you get something to look at. You can tell instantly if it's wrong or right. Well, maybe not instantly always, but then you can fix it. That's how this goes. So this is an example of a shape where I think we definitely got nudged a bit far with the toning in of things. So let's first just take out a nice chunk of that before we even think of creating an outline. Since we have this darker mass, we can just, you know, push it to a nice acceptable shape with the eraser first, and now we don't have to fix things with this over a very, you know, formless mass, let's say. So here you perhaps notice that this mark got a little bit darker. Sometimes on these sticks you have areas that are, you know, they might have a knot in them or something. The point might feel very hard, it barely leaves a mark, and then once you get through that point it starts leaving more soft, easy marks for you. That happens, it's a part of the medium. The sticks aren't 100% consistent naturally because they're charcoal, they're wood that is burnt basically, or in a way at least. So yeah, they're not perfect, they're not like machined with zero imperfections. They're natural. And here I can see that, you know, this side is a little bit harder. Maybe if I turn it, it leaves a nice dark mark. And if you find yourself struggling against the stick you're using, just sharpen it a little bit more. You'll probably get through that point, and then just enjoy the new sharp stick as opposed to the previous one that felt wrong to you. On this whole sharpening thing, I think it's a good idea to keep in mind that if you don't have the patience to sharpen a stick like this, then you'll never have the patience to, you know, go through a whole process like this. So it's a good sort of meditation and exercise in just patience, using a good like 3 to 5 minutes to sharpen a stick. You know, if you start with the sort of square base of this stick, you'll take a good 5 minutes to reach this point. And yeah, it's a lot of work for a sharp stick, but also it takes a little bit less every time you re-sharpen a stick like this, because you already have the sort of angles in there. You just have to take a bit of material off. But yeah, remind yourself it's also a part of the practice. Oh, and one thing. In this charcoal project, overall with a project that is basically not isolated without the background, we want to always keep in mind that everything is going to have a sort of edge to them. Maybe over here where the light is being faced, there might be very sort of crisp edges. And over here where I'm working right now, it's, you know, dark facing the shadow. We don't need to have this, you know, razor sharp edge going all along this line because we're working in the articulation stage. We want to be less ambiguous than the construct stage. We want to be decisive, but we don't need to have it razor sharp. That actually might hinder us in the future. So just a note, because in the graphite projects previously, we wanted to aim for as sharp as we can achieve with the outlines in many places, because that sort of also is a part of the, let's say, the precise and nice finish of the graphite drawings without the background. It's sort of a part of the aesthetic, let's say. If you have very very soft edges without the background, it sort of looks like your subject is, I don't know, slightly fading away, or like it's misty or something. So that might be super cool in an artwork, but maybe if you're just aiming for realism, that might not be the thing you want. But yeah, as I said, it might also be a cool tool to use. So yeah, here I'm just looking for these slight undulations in the bone. Again, I'm not being like extremely picky with this stuff, just to save some time, but also because we might lose the information anyways in the coming stages. I'm just hopping around here a little bit. This edge over here doesn't really matter that much. It's almost like lost in here. So we just want to have something sort of describing that area. That part was a little bit sloppy. Something to do with the angle of the line, which felt very awkward. Let's just redo that a bit. And again, here I'm not being very picky with the stuff that is outside the lines, because that's going to be dark anyway, and then very next thing we'll do is tone those things in the grouping stage. But so yeah, the articulation stage for the outline here feels like it's in a good enough spot to carry on to the next point, which is the shadows. Again, it's not like the cleanest, sharpest outline, but it's representative of the thing we're seeing, rather than just being a bunch of straight lines blocking in the shape. So we have all these smaller undulations. We don't have them like extremely precise, but we don't really want to have them yet, or need to. Again, those things would be, very small bumps and chips, and all those things would be more like a part of the rendering stage than the articulation stage at this point, because yeah, we're going to lose some of the information as we tone things in. You can imagine if I go right next to this line and make it just full on black, I'll lose some things, but I'll find them again if I need to. For example, here there's a lost edge. We don't have to find that edge. But yeah, if we have this bump over here, you can see there's a smaller dimple in the middle of that bump. We don't have that yet, but we don't have to have it. We can put that in later if we want to. And yeah, sorry if I'm repeating myself, but yeah, I just want to make sure I get all my points out there. They might be quite disorderly and all that good stuff, but at least I'm getting some info out there into the world. That's the whole goal of this project. Here I see this, maybe this outline of the shadow is a little bit on the tall side over here, so maybe I want to just slightly nudge it downwards. Yeah, things might still look a bit awkward because we haven't toned in all the dark halftones, so we're lacking stuff like this side of the eye socket, which we'll add later. But for now, the eye socket looks a bit weird because there's only this shadow sort of mapped in. So yeah, I guess we can just articulate the shadow shapes a little bit nicer now. I feel like this shape here needs a bit of work. So perhaps it goes in something like that. Actually, just want to push down this tip of the nose a little bit. It was feeling very pointy for some reason. Just a little mid-sentence nudge there. But yeah, let's just sort of reinforce this shape we're seeing here. And here we come to the articulation of the shadow shapes again. And as you remember, we don't want to have those shadows sharp, because yeah, we're going to soften those anyways when we come to the big form modeling. The form shadows, at least, that is. But yeah, we want to have these kind of clear shapes. I sort of see this shadow kind of going straight across over here. This tone is a dark half tone over there. So let's just ignore that for now. Might look a little bit weird, but that's how I see it. If you see something differently and it feels more natural to block things in, it helps you, visually or something, feel free to do things differently. Naturally, it's not a guarantee that I'm always correct in, like objectively correct in these assumptions. But I'm more like doing things that feel right to me and always remember the purpose of the whole system is that we can make this as easy and simple for the student as possible to follow. So if something feels very unnatural, if you, for example, absolutely want to have this as a light shape in here and it feels like you can get a lot of accurate stuff measured from that, or if it helps you, then by all means leave it as white at this point and tone it in later. Stuff like this. You can make these decisions along the way, and yeah, if it helps you, it helps you. You'll be the judge of that. So yeah, let's carry on the articulation of the shadows. I think I was sort of drawing this inner socket shape here, even though this edge of the temple there basically is, or the eye socket is actually in shadow in this sort of corner shape right here. So I'm now including that. I feel it looks more right at this point. Oh, and an important point for this stage, always check what you've done before you always check what you've done before you just go in and trace the line that you made previously. It's not about strengthening lines, it's about improving the drawing you've done before and making it more accurate. So don't just go in and make things dark at the lines you've already made. That's not what this step is about. So like here, I'm just comparing the slant of the eye socket. I think I had it slightly off. At least to my eye, it looks like that for now. And then maybe we can get something more accurate, like right here. This area is very soft. There's a kind of penumbra happening, so it doesn't really matter where we place this line exactly. We're gonna soften it anyways, as long as the harder points of this shadow shape is correct. Yeah, so that was what, like 15 seconds. Now I have a sharper point again. What takes time is the initial sharpening of these sticks. You can quickly hone it a little bit sharper in between sessions. I recommend you have 2 to 3 sticks always sharpened to a nice point, so you can just grab a sharper one, and then when you take a break you can just sharpen all of those up. Also, if you happen to drop one and you have only one stick, then you don't have to take like a 5-minute break to resharpen the stick entirely. So I'm kind of questioning this shadow shape of the nose here. Now that we have some tone in, I think it's looking too wide overall. Let's just carve it in a little bit. Well, actually quite a lot. I just want to make a decent change and then see what happens. Just looking for my eraser there, which was on my lap. So now that I made that change, maybe I want to remeasure sort of this width. Is it looking correct? Maybe we came a little bit too far, or maybe this shape needs to come out a little bit further towards the right, but this isn't a really strong place to measure from, so I'm hesitant to sort of base things off that. But what we can do is we can take the sort of rough thickness of this shape, and we see probably our shadow needs to be a little bit more chunky in this way. So maybe that's what I'm seeing visually, but yeah, it's creating a sensation that something is off. Now here I don't want to erase that line, so I'll just try to mush it in there. Erasing would create something that is stark white, or appearing like stark white, whereas just mushing it in there creates something that is ghosty but not very distracting. Yeah, so now I think it's looking better. So now I think just this sort of shape of this nose is a little bit off. I think we just want to slightly re-articulate this. Yeah, it's looking a lot better. Wondering if this is actually a little bit wider over here, so let's just widen it a little bit, see what happens. So I'm just trying to work a bit more visually at this stage. Visually meaning I'm just looking at these shapes and comparing them to what I'm seeing. Yeah, so what I'm seeing on here versus what I'm seeing on here. I'm trying not to rely too much on the measuring on things at this point, because that's just it's just an endless thing. You'll always find something is wrong when you measure, and you can't really always tell if it's that that you're measuring wrong or if it's that the actual thing is wrong. And it's like a puzzle, of course. In school, we measured everything to be right. That's pretty much it. We just measured until everything fits, and took like, you know, days to weeks to complete the drawing like this, to the stage where we can actually move on to the rendering and move on to the toning stage. Like for the transfer drawing, it might take, you know, days to weeks. So yeah, we don't really have that much time for this project. You might have that much time at home, and if you're struggling with initial measurements, really the only fix is to measure even more. And that is until you've done this enough that you can start really trusting your eye. Something feels off, you can trust that there is something actually off. It's not just an optical illusion. Which these things definitely happen because we're, you know, simplifying things and we don't have the same values and the same amount of information around these things. Just trying to place something reasonably accurate over here. We want to just sort of simplify this entire section into one shape. We don't have anything like a clear outline for this shadow over here, so I think if you're in doubt, just simplify. We can always start noodling around when we have more information and we know we're not going to sort of mess up all the information we found in the coming stages. So mainly after the toning in of the darks and the big form modeling. Perhaps just keep this even straight at this point. So yeah, it's starting to look like something. Perhaps that something isn't a perfect looking skull, but it is definitely starting to progress. Here I'm looking at how far up this shadow shape sort of is coming. And this is also sort of in anticipation of this lower edge of the eye socket coming in place in the plane stage, where I'll just, for demonstration's sake, I'll just put a little bit of tone over there. You can see there's this sort of shape we're left with over here. And then we can start comparing like how much width is there in this lower edge of the eye socket compared to the shadow we have underneath. Just grab that tone out of there. It's distracting. What we can do here maybe for the teeth area is we can just sort of simplify this a little bit again. We can do something a little bit more defined, like a shape like this, for example. So yeah, if this was like a strict school project that I was working on, then we would definitely, even at this stage, we would already be mapping out all the teeth and the small shadow shapes and everything. Anything that is, you know, a very distinct shape and a shadow, we would be putting in at this point. But I don't think there's a lot of sense in that because we're going to be big form modeling over all this area. I think this is going to be more efficient in terms of the process itself. I think I also sort of articulate the edges of the light shapes inside the form. So I was saying like we want to remove ambiguity when doing this stage, but that means ambiguity to yourself. You don't have to please anyone else with this drawing. You just make it clear to you where you're separating things and putting things, and that should help you as you go forward. If something is a little bit mushy like over here, I don't really mind it because I know the edge of the shadow goes over here. Now that I say it, I can of course mush a little bit of tone over there as well and get rid of the ghosty lines, but you know, I don't really care either way if it's in there or not. We'll probably lose this light shape, but we can just sort of try to keep it in there. As long as we can, that is. And that'll probably help us also, you know, retain the placement once we're toning in this area, which might get a little bit messy as well. There's a lot of like random texture over on this area, so we don't really have to replicate and duplicate that exactly. It's not like anatomical, it's just the, you know, the cracking of the cast and the sort of dimples in the original skull kind of interplaying. So yeah, it's not extremely important to get every single sort of small bump over on here. So I sort of just generically masked in this shadow edge over here. We don't have to be like extremely precise with that. Doesn't matter either way. We'll do that texture in the rendering stage over here. Just sort of deciding that this is where the shadow is going along the teeth like that. I'm seeing this as more of a half tone over here. This shadow sort of makes sense because it's kind of receding into the chin, and there's a bit of a bulge out here which creates the light shape. Yeah, so I don't really think this bit is a shadow, more so a half tone. But yeah, these are more like artistic decisions at this point. As I said, you can put your lines wherever you want and carry on from there. Doesn't make a huge difference in the end. That said, what makes a huge difference in the end is, you know, trying to be as accurate as you can with these edges that go along the light, because then you don't really want to have, you know, half a centimeter of a kind of shadow in the very lightest area of the entire picture. You want to avoid that because it's a bit depressing if you have a not so nice result after you've spent all this time blocking it in, and then once you reach the later stages of the project you realize it's hard to fix. So just take your time measuring, do the transfer if you're not very confident, and you should avoid these problems like that easily. All right, looking at this image, it's starting to look like it's almost ready for toning in the darks. But I think before we do that, we wanna just add a little bit more information for the teeth area. So this area underneath the teeth, of course, is in shadow. I think we can kind of safely map in that area. So we can already slightly articulate this area, even though, you know, we're not gonna go for very subtle things. I think it's fairly safe to put in a little bit more information. Thinking these fingers probably have a bit of shadow over here as well, but they're sort of, I want to say, detached from these shadows over here. So perhaps we can just leave those as they are for now and add those smaller details later. So yeah, perhaps that adds a little bit more information for us to go from towards the next stage. Maybe in this case I can actually use the stump a little bit. As I already applied the charcoal over there, the stump could just simply spread it around and it gave me a pretty neat result, let's say. And as I was mapping in this new shadow, I was using the green stick again. Now that I'm moving back to the articulation, again going for the orange one. Just wondering if this needs to be a little bit more left, and already it feels a bit better. Just use the tip of the stump to sort of erase a little bit more like smudge, but when we get really dark, this thing actually works as an eraser that doesn't really go all the way, it just takes it into a mid-tone kind of range. It's a very useful tool, I think, in terms of finding the lighter things in the shadow areas.